Well, that's a very dear question to my heart because it's something that I'm very passionate about, whether they be school level teachers or teachers in the university sector or higher education. The first thing that I really think is most important, and it might be self-evident, but they need to be aware of their own philosophy of teaching. And my experience is that many people are not aware of their philosophy. It's something that they've articulated internally but not been able to explicitly state. So our philosophies of teaching are very powerful. The pedagogies, the teaching principles, teaching and learning principles we base our practice on are what determine the way we use new technologies. What we know from history is that the path of least resistance is that many teachers will take a new technology and apply it to very old and traditional ways of teaching. So I suppose with the types of technologies we now have, what we're really wanting teachers to reflect on are ways in which they can avoid the scenario in which we end up using 21st century technologies on 21st century networks, if you like, using 1950s and 1960s styles of teaching, very transmissional sorts of forms of teaching. Having said that, there is no single right philosophy of teaching. I think that's a principle that we also need to understand. In many cases we hear a lot written about the way teachers can use new technologies according to constructivist ways of teaching. That's a term that's become very common and popular with new technologies. I'm quite critical of that view in actual fact because I'm very wary of any single metaphor of teaching. And I'll give you an example of my own pedagogical compass, I call it, in which I anchor my own philosophy. And the tool that I like to use with teachers to get them to think about their own philosophies. There are 4 points to the compass. The first is teaching by, or I'll use it as learning, put it in the language of the learner, learning by listening. That's a fairly traditional way of teaching. Learning by doing, learning by making, which goes beyond the doing, and then learning by sharing. Each of those points on the compass actually links to a particular suite of theories. Learning by listening is about the behavioural approach. More contemporarily, the learning by sharing is about more the communicative networked understandings of learning. Now, the reason I use the metaphor of a compass is because a good teacher is not going to just base their philosophy, in my opinion, around learning by doing. It's actually going to swing between all 4 points, and different technologies will have strengths and affordances for each of those different points of the compass. The art and the science of teaching is understanding which compass point to be pointing and directing toward according to what outcomes you're seeking and what the technologies you have available. Now, I know that's a fairly theoretical sort of answer and it may not resonate overly well with some of the people watching this video, but perhaps the point I'll end with is whatever your philosophy of teaching, it will have a huge bearing on the way you assess learning. And if we really want to be quite pragmatic or practical about the experience the learner has, perhaps one area that we really need to focus our professional development is on assessment for learning. Because if you change the assessment, change what we're asking learners to do, you can fundamentally change the learning experience from being very passive to being very active. Well, I think the first thing is you have to have a commitment to your own professional development. Teaching is not just a job, it's a passion, it's a noble profession. And without that attitude, without that ethos, then everything else is quite challenging. But if we really want to be very practical, I think one thing we often overlook is that the teachers actually need access to the technology. Much of what we talk about, some of what I've talked about, is theoretical if we don't get the opportunity to experiment, to play with the technologies. So that's a very important component. You know, if you think about young children and the way they learn, play is a very important part of learning. I think we too often focus on formal learning when much of what I've learnt and much what that is important to me was learnt outside of classrooms. So I'm talking about opportunities both in formal situations but outside of the formal teaching situation to have the technology. Once you've got the technology, I think you have to actively seek out mentors. Now, leadership and organisations, schools and other organisations have a key role here. Those leaders, again, operate at different levels and they have a role. One of the things we know about mentoring is something that's quite organic. You can assign a mentor, you can have, and many teachers have these formal professional relationships, but the most effective ones are ones where there's just an organic growing of that relationship of trust. And sometimes I like the concept of mentoring circles, where there isn't this mentor and mentee, but it's a whole micro community, if you like, that's really can be quite powerful. I guess it goes without saying, in light of what I said about having the right ethos, that you have to have a commitment to being a learner. So one of the most practical things you can do, and hopefully is rewarded and valued in your school context, is to continue your study. There are lots of opportunities now to be able to continue and advance and maybe get master's degrees and even doctors of education. And one of the nice things about that is you can actually use the technologies in your own learning and model and see what type of technology works. And I think one of the most important skills of the teachers we need today are the technologies that don't work and that shouldn't be used. As part of being a learner, you would also want to be actively seeking out and being a member of the various professional communities that exist. Those will be at the local level, they'll be at the national level, but now again you have the opportunity to be a member of international communities. And probably my final point, this is possibly for more experienced teachers, but I think it's part of the ethos of aspiring in a professional community to move from just being a consumer of other ideas and information to now becoming not just a consumer but a producer of knowledge. Dare to dream. You can have a good idea, you can make a difference, you can contribute something, and for my mind, I guess the way I think about this is that if ultimately the goal of using new technologies in education is to develop talented, creative and innovative students, we actually need creative, innovative and talented teachers. That's absolutely essential, and the way to develop those kinds of teachers, to give them the opportunity to dream, to be creative and to make a difference.